If you love donks as much as I do, then you'll love this video. Donking occurs in theory on equity shifting cards, but it's tricky to implement because it occurs rarely and it is fairly understudied. Because of this, it can be difficult but rewarding to understand how people play against donks and then use that information to create a theory-driven, exploitative strategy. I'm excited to get right to it. And if you're a part of a CFP or a study group, then I'm excited to tell you that I have an exceptional product offer for you later on in the video. But let's learn some donks and help you get to high stakes. Donking occurs at some frequency all over the game tree. For the sake of clarity, we'll narrow our focus to turn donks from the single raise pot out of position preflop caller. The first question we want to ask is, why does donking occur in theory? Donking occurs on equity shifting turns, meaning cards that significantly shift the equity of out of position's range in their favor. Here's an example. Big Blind is facing a small overbet from button on King Jack 3. Big Blind obviously folds a lot of junk, which condenses their calling range down to a lot of Jack X and King X. Now, it's important to note that button does not have a lot of Jack X in their range when overbetting on the flop. Obviously, Jack X just prefers to check because it's not strong enough to bet big. So on a Jack of Clubs turn, Big Blind is expected to donk almost their entire range. To explain why donking occurs, I'll follow QI's method of asking, what would happen if we didn't donk? And if we didn't donk here, we would simply be missing out on value. If we node lock Big Blind to check 100% of the time, then button checks back 100% of the time. So we simply have a large equity advantage and need to capitalize on it in order to get paid. And if you're wondering where donking occurs, the simple heuristic is that on the turn, in order of frequency, most donking occurs on pairing cards, then on 4-card straight turns, then on flush closing turns, but only after calling a large bet on the flop. So just remember that pattern and you'll be good to go. Now the preferred donk bet size is also important to discuss because it helps explain solver's thought process. Almost always, turn donks will be small in size because of the range versus range interaction. On the Jack of Clubs turn, we make a lot of new strong hands, but we also have a lot of marginal top pairs. Furthermore, our opponent's range mainly consists of marginal top pairs. So let's again follow QI's method of asking, what would happen if we donked big? Well, if we donked big, say 125% of the pot, then a few things would happen. Firstly, yes, we'd get paid more when we hold Jack X and our opponent calls. Trips are effectively the nuts here. But we would also be unable to bet our King X because it's just not strong enough to overbet. So we have to check a lot of this King X. And to protect our King X, we'd have to start checking a lot of trips. Looking at button's strategy after we check, we can see that A, the EV of their own top pairs decreases because we're slow playing a lot of strong hands, and as a result, B, their overall check back frequency increases. So if we protect our King X by checking back a lot of Jack X, then again, the problem is that our opponent will just check back too often, and so we miss out on the value. It's also vital to note that versus the small bet, our opponent should be raising at a very high frequency. If our opponent does not raise us often enough, which we'll talk about a bit later in the video, then it might make a little bit less sense for us to bet our Jack X for that size. There's one more vital concept to learn, and this has to do with our opponent's bet size. Equity shifts are much more significant when a larger bet size has been used earlier in the hand. So there's a lot more donking happening on specific cards. If we're playing as Big Blind versus button on 8-7 deuce and call a 30% flop c-bet, then there isn't all that much donking happening on the 7 pairing turn. And this is of course because our range isn't super condensed after calling a small flop c-bet, and also because button has a lot of 7x for that bet size themselves. But if button used a 75% flop c-bet size, then we should be donking our entire range. And this is not something I see many players do. If you want to see a lot of practical examples of turn donking and river donking, then check out a free video that I have posted in my Discord. You'll also be able to see my exploitative thought process. It's a 100% free video, I go through a lot of spots, definitely join the Discord, definitely get that free value. Now, all of this sounds good in theory, but let's talk practice. In my opinion, there are two main things that are holding people back from donking more often, and it's important to address both. Number one is going to be the uncertainty of how your opponents are going to react versus the donk. For instance, you're holding King 5 on King Jack 3 Jack. It feels really weird to play a small donk here. It doesn't seem like you get called by worse very often, and so intuitively, it might just seem like checking is preferable. As I discussed in that coaching video, this is a pretty big mistake. Number 2 is just not knowing how to play after donking. You'll get called very often, and a lot of people just don't know how to navigate the river. As a result, they might just choose to simplify their strategy and avoid donking altogether. This is understandable, but again, it's a mistake. In the rest of the video, I'll address both of these concerns by combining mass data analysis with theory. This is similar to how I do my private coaching, and there's lots of information available on the website. So let's talk data first, and this is going to address concern number 1, not knowing how our opponents react versus that donk. Here, I've compiled a list of stats showing how our opponents deviate from Nash as either the single raised pot in position preflop raiser or the in position preflop caller. They play quite similar in both. Versus a turn donk, they do not overfold, but they under-raise. They also overfold versus a subsequent river barrel, which sometimes makes this a good line for bluffing. As an added bonus, I've also included some data about river donks here. People overfold and under-raise versus river donks. While we won't touch those in this video, I've included a few example spots and talk a bit about river donks as an exploit in that free video that I've put together on my Discord. In my opinion, the way people play versus donks makes a lot of intuitive sense. Looking at button strategy versus a small donk on 8-7 deuce 7, you'll see that they have to raise a lot of top pairs and a ton of air. It's not incredibly intuitive to get this right, especially after betting big on the flop. A lot of people might put big blind on far too much 7x here, and so they might consider it just a safer option to call their 8x instead. In addition, if our opponents put us on too much 7x, it's easy to imagine why they might overfold on the river. I've talked about this a few times in other videos, but the average reg is quite risk averse. So it's easy to understand that when facing a new and uncomfortable line, the average reg would default to overfolding. But let's actually talk about our river strategy after donking and getting called to address concern number 2, which was not knowing how to play that line. I think that it's important to have some sort of baseline to go off of, and every baseline begins by understanding the range versus range interaction. When we donk on 8-7 deuce 7, we mainly hold trips and made pairs. Our opponent doesn't have that many trips, so their calling range is instead condensed around overpairs, top pairs, and ace highs. Keep this range asymmetry in mind as we discuss the overall river strategy. On almost all rivers, we'll see 3 main bet sizes used. A large bet size with our strongest hands, a medium bet size with our medium strength hands, and then a small bet size with our weakest hands. This pattern is pretty universal, but it's very important to understand. So let's take a deep dive into one particular spot to see how this plays out. On a Queen of Clubs river, we'll see that the large bet size is used by our trips. This makes a lot of sense. Our opponent doesn't really hold all that much 7x, so we can bet these hands big. We happen to have a lot of them here, which allows us to use this bet size at Nash and still have enough trips to balance out our smaller bet size. Next, let's look at the medium bet size. Very simply, this size is used by medium strength hands. Usually, this is the size that top pairs prefer. Lastly, let's examine that small bet size. It's mainly used by hands that are weaker than top pair, but can still, very importantly, get a bit of thin value. And this overall pattern will carry over to almost any river. Looking at King Jack 3 Jack 8, you'll see the same 3 bet sizes used. The thresholds do change up a little bit, so stronger top pairs bet medium and weaker top pairs bet a bit smaller, but the overall pattern is very much the same. Now it's super important to understand buttons defending threshold, and this is again something that I've included in that free video, which you can find on the Discord. And last but not least, I want to discuss that product offer for the CFPs and for the groups. I have just released the Chai Range Checker, which is the most powerful hand-to-note 4 pop-up available on the market. Hand-to-note is a software that is currently 100% free and is used by many professional poker players, CFPs, etc. And this stat checker is massive. It features over 7,500 stats. The free demo alone has over 2,500 stats, which is the equivalent of the second competitor. If you do any form of self-database analysis, mass database analysis, or would like to learn how to do those effectively, check out the website. Not only is there a full product description as well as a video for you, but there's also a free guide demonstrating how to do each effectively. And I'm offering massive group discounts until November 1st. So even if you're a small group of just 4 or more people, you are eligible for that massive group discount. Follow the link to the website.